In this video, we'll be looking at the worksheet object and how we can use it in our code. Like with workbooks, there are a few different ways we can reference worksheets in Excel, and first is by referencing the number of the worksheet, which is helpful if we're looping through all of the sheets or if we don't know the sheet names, but generally speaking, it's best practice to reference the worksheet directly using its name, which is the second reference method. The third method is referencing the currently active sheet, similar to how we can use active workbook. The last reference method, which is plain sheets, can be used to refer to any sheet type in Excel, not just worksheets. Worksheets are what Excel defaults to when you add new sheets. Is what you're used to seeing, these sheets with lots of cells that we can enter data into. A chart sheet is the second most common sheet type, and it contains a chart but none of the data. It's different than embedding a chart onto your worksheet like most people do. You can also have dialog and macro sheets, but these are almost never used. You can see these options by right-clicking on your sheet and selecting Insert. And we can see here we have a couple of different options: worksheet, chart, macro, dialog. If we insert a chart sheet just to see, we can see this is a completely blank sheet. There's no data, there's no cells or anything. It is just this chart. So we'll go ahead and delete this and go back to our worksheet here. Now we can activate and count worksheets just like we can with workbooks. We can also protect or unprotect individual sheets like we could with workbooks, and that's a super helpful tool to use with VBA. You can add sheets, you can delete sheets, you can copy and paste them, all of which is again useful to do in VBA. And again, you can see the full list of interactions you can use with worksheets if you go to Microsoft's help site or look up the worksheet object in the object library. These are the most common properties that you'll probably interact with using the worksheet object. First is the sheet name, which is pretty obvious. It gets you the name of the sheet. The second is the list objects property, and this will let you reference objects such as tables that might appear on the sheet. The row property you can use to delete, insert, or count rows on the sheet, and the columns property lets you delete, insert, or count columns on the sheet, all of which is really helpful to do. So now that we understand a little bit about how the worksheet object works, we can actually go and apply some of these actions and interactions in VBA. So I'll go to my Developer tab, click Visual Basic to open up my Visual Basic window. And you can see here I've already inserted a module. In this case it's module 2 because I had an existing module already. And I've gone ahead and I've written some code. So I'll give you a second to pause and copy this code if you want to. And that should have been enough time. So now I'm going to walk through this line by line. So the first thing I did was create an integer variable, C. And I'm going to use C to store the count of my worksheets. So I would expect the system to count however many worksheets I have in my active workbook, which should be this example workbook. It's the only workbook I have open. And it should return that C as a message box. So I would expect this to read, in this case, 3 because I only have 3 sheets in my workbook. Now I'm going to use the same trick I used in the workbook video. We can actually create a worksheet variable type, which I've called WS. And since it's an object type variable, we need to use set when we decide what this variable stands for. And in this case, I've gone ahead and I've specified my workbook, so we know even if I have other workbooks open, my WS variable here is always going to represent this workbook. And then in this worksheet, so in this case, I've told it to look at the worksheet objects. So if I go into my file here, we can see worksheet objects is the name of this particular sheet. So if I come back into my VBA, we can see that matches up with the name that I've inserted here. So every time I type WS, that's the sheet it's going to be referring to. So the first thing I did was protect this WS sheet. And I inserted a password here, and if I hit space, we can take a look at this really quick. So the password I've given it is just quote password. It's a simple text string, there's nothing fancy about it. All of these other inputs here, they are all true and false inputs, and they're all pretty straightforward. For example, if we put false for allow deleting rows, the user wouldn't be able to delete rows when this sheet is password protected. But if we put true, then the user would be allowed to delete rows even if they weren't allowed to delete the columns or to format the columns or anything like that. One interesting property here is the user interface input. And what this means is that if we put true for this, then it applies only to the user interface, meaning it doesn't apply to our VBA code. So for our macro, essentially the workbook would still, or the worksheet would still be unprotected. But for the user, it would be a protected worksheet. So that's a particularly useful property that you might want to pay attention to. In this case, I'm going to let all of those to default whatever they are usually in Excel, whatever my Excel usually defaults them to, and I'm just going to apply password to it, which I've just typed password for. Now I'm going to create a second worksheet. And so I've gone ahead and I've created a second worksheet variable, which I'm calling WS2. And then I've set that worksheet variable equal to, again, the same workbook that I want to be in, this only workbook that I have open. And this time I've used .sheets.add. Now when you add sheets to a workbook, you should use the sheets type reference instead of the worksheets reference. And that's because we can actually specify if we wanted to add a chart sheet or a worksheet sheet or a macro sheet or a dialog sheet or whatever type of sheet we want to add. If we don't specify at all, it's just going to default to a worksheet, which is fine in this scenario, so we'll let it default. Now I put a WS activate. So again, when we add this sheet, the sheet that we've just added will automatically activate. So with WS activate, we should see our screen bounce back to this original worksheet that we were working in, this worksheet object sheet. And then WS2 activate, so we should see everything bounce back into our WS2 sheet, which is that new sheet. Now, just to give a quick example, I went ahead and created two values that should show up on our new sheet here. The first is in row 2, column 2, and it should read test. The next is in row 3, column 3, and it should read test 2. Now I created those values, those cell values on the sheet so that we can see the effects of deleting a row and deleting a column. So this line will delete row 2 off of our worksheet 2 here, which is the one we added, and this will delete column 3. So we should see both of these values ultimately disappear as this row and this column are deleted. The last thing I'm going to do down here, I'm going to create a name variable, which I'm going to pull as the name property of the worksheet. And then I'm going to display that name in a message box, so we'll know exactly what this sheet is called. The very last thing I'll do is copy the worksheet. And if I hit space here, we can see what these inputs are. So after you copy a worksheet, you can decide to tell the system where to paste that worksheet. So we can either put it before something or we can put it after something. In this case, I've told it to go ahead and put this before my original worksheet, which was this Worksheet Objects sheet file here. So we're going to go ahead and delete this sheet that we had originally added. It'll probably be named something like Sheet 1 or Sheet 2, and it's this original sheet that we added up here. But we're going to leave this copied sheet, which will be like Sheet 1 copy or Sheet 2 copy, and we're going to leave that in our file. So we should still see the copied sheet, but we shouldn't see the original sheet that we had added when we're done. So now we're going to go ahead and run this code and test it out, make sure it's behaving properly, and we're going to do this line by line so we can see what each of these individual statements does in VBA. And we're going to do this by using F8 on our keyboard, or if you go up to debug, you can use step into right here, and we can see F8 is the associated keyboard shortcut. So I'll go ahead and click on this to start the macro. And now I'll step through this with the F8 key. So the first thing that this line does is count our worksheets, and then provide that in a message box. So when I hit F8, I should see a message box, which I do, and it tells me I have 3 worksheets, which is what we expect. We have 3 worksheets down here, so we know that our worksheet count function is literally just counting the number of worksheets we have in this particular workbook. So I'll click OK. Now we're going to go ahead and set up this little shortcut that we have, all referencing our Worksheet Objects sheet that is in our workbook. And we're going to go ahead and password protect that sheet. So now when I come back to this the Worksheet Object sheet later, I should have to unpassword protect it to change anything. The next thing we're going to do is add a sheet. And at this point, I will make these half windows so that we can see the direct impact of this VBA code. So make sure you click back into your VBA code if you just half your windows to make sure that when you hit F8, it is responding in VBA. So we'll make sure we're clicked into this and hit F8. And we can see we have actually added a new sheet here. In this case, it's called Sheet 1. Now when I hit F8, you'll notice that right now my Sheet 1, which is the sheet I just added, my WS2, is what's active right now. So when I hit F8 off of this line, we should see my original sheet that I identified up here activate instead, which it does. We can see we've jumped back to our worksheet objects, which is what we would expect. When I hit F8 again, we should jump back to that sheet we just added. So that's the difference between activating your worksheets. It's the same as when we were activating workbooks before. It's the same as when we manually click around on these sheets down here. It just changes which sheet is active right now. So I've gone ahead and I've added these two test strings right here so we can see the effect of the deleting of rows and columns. So we'll go ahead and hit F8 here, and we see our test value shows up in cell B2. F8 again, test 2 shows up in cell C3, which is what we expect. So now we're going to go ahead and delete row 2, which means this entire row that contains this test right here should disappear. So that's about how we expected. And now we're going to delete all of column 3, which is this column C right here. So this test 2 should disappear. So now we know that the deleting of columns and rows behaves how we expected. Now we're going to go ahead and identify the name of the sheet, which we can see down here should be sheet 1. So I'll hit F8 and then F8 again to see what shows up in this message box. And it is sheet 1, so we know this is how the name property of our sheet behaves. It's behaving as expected. So we'll click OK. Now this line should copy the sheet 1 that we added in here originally, so this sheet that I have active right now, and it should make a copy of this before my WS, which was this original worksheet objects here. So we should see a second sheet show up like right here in our tabs, and it should be called sheet 1 copy or something like that. So we'll hit F8. And we can see we have sheet 1, 2, which is essentially the same thing as sheet 1 copy. This is just a copy of the sheet 1 file. So now when I hit F8 one more time, we should see this original sheet 1 that we have here deleted. Now, we did talk a little bit before in a previous video about how we can actually turn off these dialog boxes. So if you're doing a lot of deleting sheets or saving or things that might trigger these dialog boxes, you can actually turn them off. And we went over that in our dialog video a while back. But for now, we'll just go ahead and approve this request, say delete. And we can see it did actually delete that sheet 1 we had down there. And now this is the last step. Hit F8 one more time, and we've completed our subroutine. So now that we have a general understanding of the worksheet object, we kind of went through how to apply all of these different properties and different interactions that we covered here. And now we have a pretty good understanding of what the worksheet object is and how to use it in VBA.